Without any further ado, I would like to invite Professor Sujit Sivasundaram to deliver his talk. Over to you, Sujit.
Thank you so much, Samal, for the introduction, and Johan and Dana and Nirmal as well. Hopefully you can hear me, though it's a different time zone. You can hear me clearly as I speak. It's a real privilege to have this invitation. Thank you so much. This is a very important project that you're engaged with. And I, of course, grew up in Sri Lanka. My father is from Jaffna, outside Jaffna, and my mother is from Colombo and from the south. So I have both sides of the conversation in me in some ways. So yeah, so it's a very big privilege to give this talk. And thank you for the invitation. So what I'm going to do is actually to give a talk which has two sections to it. I'm going to introduce this new book, which I just published in the UK. Sadly, it's not available in Sri Lanka, but I have allowed Samal and Nirmal and Dana to have a PDF copy of it. And so if anybody wants to have it, just ask them and they will let you have a copy of it electronically. I hope to get some copies of the book into Sri Lanka before too long, but it's a bit difficult at the moment with the pandemic. So the book is called, it looks like this. I've just got a copy of it here. And it's called Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire. So a while ago, I published this book on Sri Lanka, which Samal very kindly mentioned. And in some ways, the argument of this new book is trying to take some of the things that I found in researching on Sri Lanka and to think about it more widely in the whole of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in the late 18th and the early 19th century. Now, I have got some slides, and Samal, because for some reason I can't be the co-host, so Samal is going to show my slides. If we can just have the first slide up, Samal, is that going to be possible?
Sure. I'm working on that.
Okay, yeah. So as Samal said, I basically work on the late 18th and the early 19th century in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. That was the period that I wrote a book on Sri Lanka as well. And so this new book is also about the late 18th and the early 19th century. So the first slide is just showing the cover, but I've shown you the book already. The second slide, yeah, is what I want now, yeah. So basically the title of the book is Waves Across the South. And so I'm actually kind of using the idea of the wave. So in this period, when you're going from sea to land, it's a dangerous thing. Things can go wrong. You can be shipwrecked. Various things can be washed. I mean, people can be washed ashore, aboard, off the ship, and so on. So I'm actually using the idea of the wave in the book as the sort of environmental kind of notion, really, to understand the political changes of the period. And so here we have a wave outside Madras. And so the European people, 2 European men are being taken from the European ship off onto the beach. And actually a lot of the hard work is being done by South Asian people who are, taking these 2 European men across the wave onto the beach. Now it's an environmental, the sort of environmental context. This sort of context of what's going on by the sea is really, really important for the political and cultural and social changes of the late 18th and the early 19th century, because a lot of things are coming from the sea, a lot of people are coming, a lot of invaders are coming across the sea in this period, of course. But I'm actually using the idea of the wave also to summarize the analytical argument of the book, because this is the period of the age of revolutions. And I'm saying that actually in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, there was also an age of revolutions. And first, there was a wave of indigenous, non-European protest, agency, resistance, which was then overtaken by another wave, which was like a kind of tsunami, which was the imperial wave of this period. So I'm actually using the idea of the wave to summarize the argument, at the same time as I'm saying that actually this kind of context where you have the breaking wave is the kind of material and environmental context for the story as well. So there are 2 waves. There's an indigenous, non-European wave of association, of protest, of rebellion, right across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And then into that comes this other wave, which is the wave of imperialism, primarily the British Empire in this period, which is overtaking the French Empire and the Dutch Empire and Eurasian imperial structures as well in the late 18th and the 19th century. Now, the Age of Revolutions as a concept, is mostly used by Atlantic historians, and they use it to think about the origins of the modern world. And the way the story normally goes is, there was the American Revolution, there's the French Revolution, there's the Industrial Revolution, there's a revolution in Haiti, and you get the first independent Black Republic. Then there are Latin American independence movements against the Spanish in Latin America. And because of all those revolutions in the Atlantic world, you get a new system of thinking about rights and equality, and also citizenship and belonging, and that new political structures are created, which are central, for instance, nation states, to the modern world. So what I'm doing is actually I'm taking that story from the Atlantic, which is normally dominated by Atlantic historians, and saying, actually, we need to think about it for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as well. And in relation to these two waves of indigenous protest, rebellion, and association, and imperialism. And in placing then the rise of the British Empire as a wave, I'm actually saying that the British Empire is a counter-revolution, which is a big sort of, that's one of the main claims of the book. So what it's doing is it's actually reacting, it's reacting to the resistance, to the revolutionary kind of potential of the period, and actually turning it upside down and neutralizing it, suppressing it, and folding it in to its own structures. And so the two waves are related, really. One wave is following the other wave in the story. The indigenous wave, the Asian wave, the Pacific Islander wave, the African wave is being followed by the imperial wave of the British Empire. So I'm using this idea of the wave because in the literature of world history that I am engaged with, recently a lot of scholars who have been writing have been using this idea of the network, and globalization is like a network, like a circuit, and lots of things are moving, and the late 18th century and the early 19th century is a period of unprecedented globalization, people argue. But I want to actually keep this idea of the wave because it's more consistent with this period, which is a period where a lot of things are happening over water, but it's also consistent with the violence of this era. Because if we are thinking about, networks and hubs and circuits, which is the language we are always using today for globalization, because we are, even now on the internet, we forget actually that there was a great deal of violence and disruption and lags and miscommunication and theft in this era. And so it's to get to that and to kind of highlight that that actually comes partly from the environmental context of the ocean as well, and its unpredictability that I am using this wave. So as I say in the historiography, in the historical literature, this story has been mostly an Atlantic story from the French, American Revolution, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, Haitian Revolution, Spanish independence movements in Latin America. And then it goes in the story to the East. So I found this actually unacceptable as somebody also who grew up in Sri Lanka, because having taught in the West now, I find this to be a very Atlantic-centric and Eurocentric story. But some other historians were already talking about, like Chris Bailey and so forth, about a global crisis in this period, where in Asia as well, there were these big empires, the Mughal Empire, the Qing Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. And they were having a crisis in the late 18th and the early 19th century. They had overexpanded. There was a collapse in world trade. there were rebellions at the fringes of these empires, and these empires were having to deal with the arrival of new kinds of Europeans, for instance, the East India Company in India. So that story was already there in some ways, in addition to this Atlantic narrative of the age of revolutions. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to actually take that story about, first, of course, the Atlantic story of the age of revolutions to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, but also this Eurasian story of the rise of Europe across Asia, away from the continental landmass, down to the ocean. Because I think sometimes in the story of the late 18th and the early 19th century, certainly in the West, it's North India, Bengal that everyone writes about, or China, or the Middle East. And they have actually not engaged with the island societies and oceanic societies of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which are very heavily marginalized in the literature. So I'm trying to kind of take the narrative of the global crisis of the late 18th and the early 19th century to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so I guess the starting kind of idea is that in these small places, small islands, and in port cities, and along the beaches and the ocean-facing places of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, people are experimenting with new politics. They're experimenting with new ideas, and they're actually forming connections across the water in this period, which follow on what already was there, but which is accelerating in this period. And so that is the first wave, the indigenous wave. And then there's also colonialism, and the colonists are also using these small islands and ports to experiment with governance, to experiment with labor, to experiment with reform. And so actually these sites, which have been, I would argue, marginalized in these global histories, are actually really, really important for the big history of the late 18th and the early 19th century. So that's the first part of the talk, which just gives you a little bit of an overview of the book and the argument. But I thought what I would do is, so Sri Lanka is in the book, but it's not there for very long in the book, actually, because I was trying to use the material from Sri Lanka, but to place it into this bigger landscape of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. I'm actually hoping my next book that I will write on Sri Lanka again. So I'm looking forward to coming home and working on Sri Lanka after, now that this book is out. But this book only had a little bit on Sri Lanka. But what I was trying to do, as I say, was to place all these islands and ocean-facing places together in this book, Waves Across the South. And so the material on Sri Lanka, which is in the book, comes in the chapters on the Bay of Bengal. And these chapters on the Bay of Bengal are on war and on knowledge. So what I thought I would do in this second half of this talk is to talk about war and knowledge. So as I've said, the overall argument is about the age of revolutions, and that there is this indigenous rebellion, resistance, presence, association, mobility, which is a wave, which is overtaken by this other wave, which is imperial. But some of the ways that works, firstly, war and knowledge are two themes. There are other themes in the book, but I will just focus today on war and knowledge to illustrate this dynamic. So more broadly, in this period, there is an argument about warfare, because you could argue that, where are my notes now on this? That the British war machine is coming into the Indian Ocean in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. And the global crisis that I mentioned earlier of Eurasian empires is partly about, I mean, certainly you can talk about technology. So, the British might have better weapons than local imperial forces. But that's not really enough. It's actually about the cost of the war as well. So the British can tax and they can gather revenue in order to keep a standing army. And then non-European political formations are unable then to keep up with the cost of war. And so a gap opens up. And that's partly then how you get this very ruthless military machine of the British coming in. It's not only, I would say, about the technology, it's actually about the military and economic dimensions as well. So there is that argument already in the literature about warfare in this period. So what I'm doing is I'm actually trying to kind of take that argument to the Bay of Bengal. Normally it's an argument you find, in India or maybe in relation to Sri Lanka alone. But what I'm trying to do is to see it as something happening across the Bay of Bengal, because warfare, I would argue, is happening here across the water. It means that actually in this chapter, I connect warfare in Burma, Myanmar, with warfare in Sri Lanka, with warfare in Java in the early 19th century, and argue that actually all three of these contexts of invasion and looting and pillage were interconnected because they were happening at the maritime frontier of British India, which had to be stabilized by the British. But in addition to that colonial dimension of connections connected to warfare, I also argue that there's an indigenous dimension, because of course there are a lot of Buddhist connections between Burma, Myanmar, the Kingdom of Ava, and the Kingdom of Kandy. And there are also fighters who connect up the story out to the Malay world and to Java in these contexts. And so, in fact, if you think about those two waves in relation to warfare, there is a lot of kind of existent connection across the Bay of Bengal, into which the British are then coming and utilizing for their own purposes, as they also mount this, very aggressive warfare across the Bay of Bengal. So firstly, I'm going to go to Burma, Myanmar, for a few minutes and give you some idea of the sources. And of course, the war in Burma, Myanmar is in the mid-1820s, the First Anglo-Burmese War. And maybe we can have the next slide, Samal, actually, whilst I'm doing this. So the next slide is of a Burmese warboat on the Irrawaddy River. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read some letters very quickly, just two letters, just to give you an idea of the sources from the 1820s in Burma. And these letters were written by a Buddhist monk whose name is Mang Nu. He was a Buddhist monk who hadn't gone above the status of a novice monk. And he basically, one of the things he did, so he's a novice monk, but he writes letters for other people. And so it's very unusual. We actually have these letters which he writes for people who can't write. So effectively he becomes like a letter writer for illiterate people who can't write letters. And so it's actually a really interesting insight into what is going on in Burma in this early 19th century period. The king, Bodhapaya, invites this monk to keep residence in his capital in Amarapura. Now you can go to it very close to Mandalay. And so these letters are written actually, of course, on palm leaf. So here is one letter which the monk is writing for somebody called Lotus Leaf. He's writing for a man called Lotus Leaf. And he says, of the Bay of Bengal and the city of Rangoon, which is in the south, because the Kingdom of Ava is in the north, and so Rangoon is in the south, all sorts of sailors, strangers, aliens in habit and custom and belonging to many races, all of which I cannot name, are in Rangoon. Armenians, Roman Catholics, Portuguese, Africans, Arabs, all kinds of Indians, including Hindu sadhus, Muslim crewmen, Bombay merchants. They're hairy people with mustaches, side whiskers, beards, energetic and alert. They hustle and bustle from place to place, round and up and down, in and out, to and fro, winding and curving, to all nooks and corners, east and north and west and south. In another letter, he writes that really the stars are lined up against the king of Ava because of the arrival of all these people on the seaboard. where next to in the south, close to the sea. Both the astrologers and the general public are agreed that times are bad. The planets are unfavorable. Dangers are ahead for both the king and the kingdom. Unfortunately for you, my son, the person he's writing for father, this letter, and so the father's writing for the son here, but it's actually written by the monk. You are in the path of his mighty army of destruction, as your business takes you to the great towns on the seaboard. So that there's going to be war on the seaboard. These maritime regions of our country shall be the scene of the king's greatest victory. So he's predicting that the king of Burma will have a victory. Now, why this is interesting is because there is, these sources are very unusual. You can see that there is a sense of danger, and there is a sense that war is about to happen. Of course, for the Europeans, they portray the king of Burma as an oriental despot, somebody who's totally ignorant. But this is not what's going on here. Of course, there is a sense of war. Now, when war happens, it's very violent. 15,000 people lose their lives. £5 million are spent. It's a very, very costly war undertaken by the British. Normally, the way the story is told is that this war is about the frontier, namely that they're worried in British India that Calcutta will be taken by the Burmese. And so because there's a worry that Calcutta will be taken, the British go in and go to war with the Burmese. But I actually see it partly, that's certainly right at one level, but it's also a maritime war, because there are ships that go across the Bay of Bengal, British ships, and they go up the Irrawaddy River all the way to Ava. And so if we go, and what happens is that they actually encounter these warboats, which you can see in this slide. And the warboats are much better at navigating the Irrawaddy than the British boats, of course. The British boats get stuck in the sand. A steamboat is used for the first time, and they think it's going to be good for the war, but actually it gets totally stuck. And the warboats of the Burmese are doing much, much better on the water in this period. If we go on to the next slide somehow. And so what is happening is that actually, this is one of my photographs from Burma. This is the Shwedagon Pagoda in Yangon. And so I was mentioning a minute ago how there are these very long-standing Buddhist connections across the Bay of Bengal.
Sujit, sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
There's a, I don't know, no, can people see the slides? I'm sharing the slides. Can you see you can see the slides, Sujit, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I can see them. Can everybody else see them?
Yeah, I'm getting a few messages.
Okay. By the way, if you want to interrupt me and ask a question, that's fine as well. You can just raise your hand and ask a question. I'm totally fine.
I think Samal, what you can do is perhaps try to make it full screen, which will make it
bigger,
yeah.
Right?
Try that.
Okay, give me a second.
Yeah, so that's the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is in Yangon, and it's huge. You see it when you go to Yangon. It basically is towering into the sky. And so I was just saying that there are these Buddhist connections across the Bay of Bengal, and so the British come in and they basically use the Shwedagon Pagoda as their headquarters for this war, which is extraordinary when you think about it. That this Buddhist pagoda is the center of the war, and there are all these sources about how they, the British soldiers, putting up their uniforms and so on in this pagoda. But also, what happens in the context of this war? So the first thing I wanted to say is that it's maritime because it's happening on the water, it's a maritime war. But the second thing I want to say is that there's a lot of looting connected to it as well. And they go right through the countryside, looting all the temples. And a huge number of Buddhist artifacts arrives in Britain. There's one man who is involved in this war called Frederick Marriott, who brings so many Buddhist artifacts back to Britain that he basically writes to the British Museum and says to the British Museum that he should become a trustee of the British Museum because he has brought all these artifacts back from Burma. So there's a huge amount of Buddhist artifacts coming in. But what I'm saying here is that it's a counter-revolution. That's what I'm saying here partly, right? The reason why I would argue there is all of this looting, and I mean, certainly war always will generate looting, but the war here is counter-revolutionary because a lot of the people who are fighting this war have fought in the Napoleonic Wars. And there in India, like Frederick Marriott has fought, the man I just mentioned, has fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He even actually draws a picture of Napoleon dying. He's in Saint Helena where Napoleon is dying, and he's at the scene of Napoleon's death. And he draws this picture of the dead body of Napoleon. So these are people who have been fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, and they kind of, you know, basically don't have anything else to do by this time in the 1820s because the Napoleonic Wars are finished, and they just go on a rampage, really, through Burma, Myanmar, looting artifacts like this. But as they're doing that, they're also seeing it as this sort of maritime frontier. If we have the next slide, Samal, I think there might be some other maritime stuff going on. This is the next one. So it's basically these boats. Yeah, so here we have, of course, you know, the traditional image of kingship in Burma, where, you know, the king is arranged on the water. And so the king's kind of image of kingship is connected to how you parade on the water and get glory on the water. So I've just given you some information here very quickly. I mean, there's more detail in the book, but basically what I'm saying is that there are these two waves. There's the sort of indigenous wave of engagement with water, of politics on water, the war boats being used very effectively actually against the British. One of the things I'm interested in is the use of petroleum. They actually, the Burmese use what they call what the British call earth oil in this period. They have these jars of petroleum on the war boats, and they just, you know, shoot the petroleum at the British, and the British don't know what has hit them. They don't understand petroleum in this period. So the Burmese are actually using their understanding of minerals as well on the water for warfare in this period. So literally, you know, it's on the one hand, all this looting and counter-revolutionary warfare, because it's coming out of the age of revolutions. On the other hand, a very strong indigenous appreciation of war, and also an appreciation of the maritime dimensions of this. Now, I'm arguing, and I'd be really interested to see how you respond, that this is a very suggestive comparison for warfare with Kandy. So that is, you know, the sort of point of debate for Sri Lankan historiography, because I'm actually saying that in Sri Lanka as well, though you don't get war boats like this, maybe, it's a similar idea of Buddhist kingship operating, which is arranging people around you to create yourself as a lord in the 18th century, and also drawing in for higher ordination and so on, monks from Burma. Actually, one of the things which I found very interesting is that though I knew about the story from Sri Lanka of connections with Burma, I looked in the Burmese royal records, and there's really fascinating material on the arrival of Sri Lankan monks in Ava in this period, coming, you know, and let me just see that I've got some material here. Where is it? Yeah, so, you know, the king of Ava saying, you know, that the Sri Lankan monks in 1806 had brought a boatry. The king of Ava saying that, you know, why have they come to Burma? How long was your journey? What calendar is used in Sri Lanka? Giving the monks permission to go to Rangoon, to bring other monks with them, etc., etc. There's a lot of really, really interesting information in the royal records of Burma about the Sri Lankan monks. So actually there is that connection in this period, in this story, between Sri Lanka and Burma, which is what I'm calling an indigenous connection across the water. But into that, of course, there is the colonial connection, which comes and, you know, overtakes in some ways, because of course there's the Orientalists who, you know, are trying to compare Burma and Sri Lanka. And there is also this whole idea of Kandy being like Ava. It's a highland kingdom. It is, for the British, it's not interested in the sea. It's, you know, closed in, it's landlocked. But that, you know, is not exactly right. There's a sort of very wide understanding of the wider world, and there are long-standing trading interests and so forth from Kandy. So there are some parallels here which are very interesting. And of course, in Sri Lanka as well, the Napoleonic, I mean, it's 1815 when the Kingdom of Kandy falls. And that is coincident with the Napoleonic moment. And I think that is an important global context to understand the nature of the violence and the nature of the looting and so on that happens. It's also then relevant for the rebellion, of course, that follows, to think of it like this. And certainly if one thinks about all the different attempts to form resistance after 1815, looking for pretenders and so on and so forth, you have the imagination of the Bay of Bengal. You have people involved in various plots who can be Malay, who can be Javanese, who can be, supposedly Siamese, African troops, etc., etc. So it's very polyglot. I won't use the word cosmopolitan, but polyglot. Lots of different kinds of people from different places are playing a role in the political imagination of Lanka in this period. And so that is in keeping with this Bay of Bengal story and the Buddhist connections of a previous age, and also of the colonial story and colonial warfare, which has happened across the Bay of Bengal. Now, I don't have time today, but the third context which I bring in here is Java, which of course is invaded by the British, and there's huge amounts of looting in Java in the context of the Napoleonic moment. They're worried, the British, of the French, which is another reason, of course, in Sri Lanka as well. We've got to keep that in mind. Earlier in the 19th century, there is this worry about the French. In Java, this is Dutch, but seen as French by the British when it's invaded by the British like this. So that kind of global context of European rivalry, but certainly not just European rivalry, but violence and looting and and aggression against republicanism is evident in Java as well. But I'm just going to keep that for another day. And can I have the next slide, Samar? Oh yeah, this is the King of Kandy. This image you will know. I was just putting it there because I thought you can compare it with the previous one, thinking about kingship. But we can go on to the next one. Yeah, so basically I'm just giving you the Bay of Bengal material and saying that war is one of the themes that this argument works across, where you have revolutionary contexts being utilized for counter-revolutionary imperialism like this by the British. But there are lots of other themes in the book. And another theme is knowledge, because I'm really interested in history of science and environment. And so I was interested in the knowledge dimensions of this. And I would argue that the knowledge in some ways is as violent as the war in the way it operates. And one of the places you can track this is from Madras. So this image is from Madras, Chennai. It's the observatory in Madras. And what is going on here is, in this picture, is that it's called a pendulum length experiment. They're trying to figure out the time a pendulum a pendulum swings from side to side, and they're trying to figure out down to like fractions of seconds, or how long it takes. And as you calculate that in different parts of the Earth, you can figure out the very, very small changes in gravitational acceleration. And on the basis of that, you can decide the curvature of the Earth. Why is this important? Because it's a period of maritime imperialism. If you have ships going from Madras to China, and there is the monsoon, and the depression in the Bay of Bengal, I remember this from being a child in Sri Lanka, all the weather systems in the Bay of Bengal are very complicated. You need to know the exact position of your ship, and that in turn depends on the exact curvature of the Earth. The Earth, isn't spherical. It bulges close to the equator. There's a small bulge, and so you need to know how to handle that. And so what's happening in Madras, I found, is that there's just huge amounts of what I would call big data. Lots of stats being collected about the air, about the wind, about the hydrology, all kinds of different data, the stars, etc. And literally the Earth is being modeled as an object, tabulated statistically as an object. Now, as this is happening, you're also getting imperialism spreading from Madras, because in addition to these experiments here taken by European astronomers together with indigenous pundits, Tamil, Brahmin pundits, the same experiments are being taken by Madras also in Southeast Asia. So Madras Observatory sends out an expedition to Sumatra. So can I have the next slide, Samal? Thank you. So what they do is they're looking for an island close to the equator, where they, because if it's on the equator, then you can do the experiments properly, where you can do this pendulum experiments. And so they find this island off Sumatra, which you can see here. Of course, these are Europeans in the front of the image, but there are South Asians dressed in blue who are doing the labor in the back of the image. If you look carefully, there are laborers there as well. So it's not just European scientists here. So basically, these experiments are being done, but there is resistance. There's a whole series of problems. Firstly, there's an earthquake in the middle of this expedition. There are tremors, plates, this is, in the middle of where plates are joining, geological plates are joining. So, the British might imagine that they're going to create this model of the Earth, which is tabulated, which is statistical, which will allow free trade imperialism to operate between Southeast Asia and China and India. But in fact, there are a whole series of natural obstacles to do with the monsoon, to do with earthquakes, to do all the people fall ill on this expedition as well. The next stage in this, if we go forward one more somehow, yeah, this is, you can see the idea here, which is you kind of, create this experimental island, which is isolated, which you can control, which you can make like a fortress for doing these observations. There are no inhabitants on this island. But if you go on to the next image, you need labor. Yeah, you need labor. And so the laborers will, there will be a rebellion. And there is rebellion in the midst of these programs. These laborers are building a lighthouse. They're cutting out stone. It's very, very hard work. And this is in Pulau Ubin, which is just off Singapore. It's a small island. You can still go, if you get fed up of Singapore, go to Pulau Ubin. If you're in Singapore ever, it's this small island, which is now, very natural. But you get stone there, and the Chinese workers are actually, cutting the stone out for the lighthouse. And in the middle of this lighthouse project, there's mutiny, there's rebellion, etc. Even the waves are too high to build this lighthouse. And the lighthouse is connected with the data operation I just mentioned, because it also is to allow ships to go between India and China. So what I'm saying here is that this data collection, which is also across the Bay of Bengal, is a counter-revolution. It's this idea of universal reason and calculation, which is coming out of the age of revolutions. But it's being done on a huge scale across so many disciplines, trying to build lighthouses, trying to allow ships to go past. It's imperial. So when Singapore is made into British Singapore, the surveying is happening on the day that the agreement is being signed. So it's totally connected to this world. So, there is this counter-revolution of data collection, but there are rebellions, there is labor in unrest, and there are indigenous intellectuals who are writing about how, their world has been totally changed by all of this science and knowledge, which is being conducted across the Bay of Bengal. And one person who I've worked on is Abdul bin Abdul Qadir, who is a bit like the Indian Tamil Brahmins who I just mentioned were assisting the Madras Observatory. He is in Singapore and he is an assistant to Raffles. And he, including other people, write about steamships and about the arrival of knowledge and about the arrival of medicine and how the world has been really changed for them as a result of that. And so thinking about how people like that reflect on their selfhood, on their identity, in the midst of all of this transformation is also then part of the indigenous wave of revolution and assertion and response to this aggressive imperialism. I think that's the last slide, Samal. Is there some more after that? I can't remember now. No, there isn't anything else. Okay, I will just very quickly finish. And so what I want to do just very quickly is, now where are my notes? They've gone somewhere, I don't know where they've gone. Oh yeah, here they are. Is I just want to say a few things in closing. So the idea here is that I wanted to kind of take the Age of Revolution story to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. By doing that, to insist that the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean are central to the rise of really the modern world, because not oftentimes the Age of Revolutions is seen to be central to the rise of the modern world. And so forms of resistance, forms of rebellion here are really, really central. But the tragedy is that they were foreclosed or stopped by this counter-revolutionary machine, which certainly included war and knowledge, but other aspects as well, which I can go into later. So I'm saying here that the British are mounting a counter-revolution. And that is sort of, an uncomfortable argument to make in Britain. And one can get very, very heavily criticized for making this argument in Britain, because normally the story goes in Britain that the British did not have a revolution. The French had a revolution. The British did not have a revolution. Because, this is a traditional argument. The British society is very cohesive and, it is able to undertake change in a very pragmatic and consensual way through agreement. We're actually saying that, that is totally wrong. Certainly revolution is being undertaken elsewhere, but at the cost of others and for imperial ends. So the language of liberty here is being proclaimed by the British, but it's being proclaimed, it's being announced, we are going to be the liberators of Burma, of Kandy. We're going to be the liberators, they will announce. And so it's the language of the Age of Revolutions, but it's being turned on its head because it's being used for imperial agendas. So it's sort of a way of understanding how an empire of such a huge scale across the Indian and Pacific Oceans could come to be at a time in the late 18th century and early 19th century where there was a lot of expectation and a lot of hope of revolution. How did all that revolution get suppressed? Well, this is how it happened. It's actually, very sinister because they took the language of the Age of Revolution and the possibilities of the Age of Revolution and turned it against itself. Now, in the book, in addition to the Bay of Bengal, there's material from the Persian Gulf, from the Pacific, from the South Indian Ocean. And what I'm trying to do partly in the book is to create a space of solidarity for colonized and indigenous peoples. So in the histories, these histories haven't been put together. Aboriginal Australian history, Maori history is in the book, Tongan history, certainly Malay history, and so on. These haven't really been put together like this for this period. But I think rather than having a nationalist history of Maori identity or of Sri Lankan identity, what I'm trying to do is to actually sort of say that these things can be looked at comparatively and in relation to connections across each of these sites. And so that is a mode of breaking down national historiography, but not just simply, as I say, just globalizing everything in a neoliberal kind of way, but rather insisting on violence and interruption in keeping with this wave idea, which I mentioned earlier. Yeah, so those are just some kind of comments. And I'm very happy to take criticism or questions or to hopefully answer some interesting questions now. Over to Samal.